The New Haven County Bar. Okay. On behalf of the New Haven County Bar Association, including the Continuing Legal Education Committee, welcome to today's CLE presentation, another episode of Tech Tuesday. Thank you, Scott, for being here and conducting these Tech Tuesday CLEs for our organization. I know some people on this group have been with you before, others may be new. Welcome to all. And Scott, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Let me share the screen. I didn't do that yet. So this Tech Tuesday is data privacy and security considerations for your practice. I have with me to do the data privacy component, Dena Castricone, who we've done this presentation before. Dena, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, folks. I am a privacy and healthcare lawyer. I've been practicing for about 19 years now. I was previously the general counsel and chief of privacy at one of the largest federally qualified health centers in the country. And then before that, I was a partner at North Carolina, where I headed up their cybersecurity and privacy group. And so now I have my own firm and I'm doing privacy and healthcare. And I will say that Scott is my IT guy and I love having him and he's fantastic. And so this is my advertisement for Scott. So if you've got a law firm and you need IT stuff, Scott's your guy.
Thank you for that. That was not planned. I did not pay her to say that. And as far as me, most of you know me by now, but I've been in IT for over 13 years. Really, I've been in IT for over 20 years. We won't talk about those early days though. And as this says, I'm a member of the 405D task force, which is tasked with improving cybersecurity in healthcare. I'm also recently joined a privacy group that's part of the NIST group. So there's an offshoot of NIST to improve privacy, and it's an international group. So meetings are a little challenging. They're all over the place, but it's interesting. They just launched probably about a month ago. The agenda for today: overview of the data privacy laws, Connecticut privacy laws, obviously most relevant for us, best practices for compliance, and then the security considerations. So the first half will be Dena, the second half will be me. Security best practices, defense in depth for small practices, and recognizing potential attacks and mitigating the risk. And of course, there will be time at the end for questions. And we'll let Dena take it away.
So before we dive in, this is such a small group, please interrupt with questions, right? There's no need to hang on to them to the end, and you don't have to use the chat because quite frankly, I'm not very good at following the chat. So just unmute yourself and shout out and we'll answer any questions. So we're going to talk about the two most relevant data privacy statutes in Connecticut. There are some others, but the two most relevant in terms of what would affect your practice and the businesses of your clients are really these two statutes that we're going to cover. As you probably know, data privacy laws are different in every single state. And this creates sort of a challenge because the law that applies depends on the residence of the individual whose information is at issue. So this means that if you've got information, so if you have I use this example all the time, a practice, an estate planning practice in Greenwich, and you have information about clients who live in New York and employees who live in New York, you're also going to be subject to the New York data privacy laws. And this patchwork of privacy laws is really kind of a nightmare. And we're hoping that at some point before too long, we'll get some federal privacy legislation that will make it easier for everyone to understand what their obligations are. But until then, we're stuck with what we've got. So we're going to start with probably one often overlooked data privacy statute that most folks generally aren't even aware exists. And it's 42-471 about safeguarding personal information. And this statute says that any person in possession of personal information must protect the information from theft or misuse. And I've got the full definition of personal information here on the slide for you. And you'll see it's a pretty broad definition, and it's basically any information that's capable of being associated with an individual. And so you've got a duty to protect personal information, and this applies to both paper and electronic information. And like I said, most folks don't even know that this statute really exists. We rarely see it enforced. In fact, I don't know that I've ever seen it enforced. The statute also requires that before you get rid of personal information, you make it unreadable or erase it or delete it permanently prior to disposing it. And this is enforced by the Department of Consumer Protection. And the penalties are $500 per violation or up to $500,000 for any single event. We can go to the next slide, Scott. So what this statute doesn't do is it doesn't tell you how you have to protect personal information. It just says you have to protect it. But it does say that if in the course of your business, you are creating social security numbers, that means, you know, if you're doing workers' comp work and you get social security numbers from clients, or if you have employees and you have your employees' social security numbers, you must have a privacy protection policy that has to be published or publicly displayed that addresses what your firm does to protect social security numbers, to prohibit unlawful disclosure of social security numbers, and to limit access to social security numbers. I will say that this applies not only to law firms, it applies to your clients and anyone else who's doing business who collects social security numbers. If you're interested in knowing what one of these privacy protection policies looks like, on my website, it's dmclawllc.com. If you click on the privacy notice and you scroll to the bottom of my privacy notice, I have a privacy protection policy. You know, you should, Scott, you can advance to the next slide. I think we're talking about the policy here. So you can see the sample or the example of a policy. You'll see that your policy has to describe specific efforts that you make to protect social security numbers. If you make any changes to that policy, you need to update it and include a revision date. And in terms of being publicly displayed, I put it on my website, which is most appropriate for me because the one employee I have is a remote worker. And so it makes most sense. If you have a larger operation and you have an HR room, you can stick it in your, I'm sorry, you have like a lunchroom, you can stick it in your lunchroom. But you also can put it on and should put it on your website if you're collecting social security numbers of clients, because then they can easily access that policy as well. And again, feel free to take a look at the one I have on my site. And again, I have never seen this statute enforced, but nonetheless, I think as we get into, we see more data breaches and we see more information compromised and enforcement is on the uptick when we're talking about protecting personal data, I think we're going to see some enforcement on this end. So it's important to know that it's out there. So next we're going to talk about the second data privacy law in Connecticut. It's 36A 701B. This is the data breach statute. And the data breach statute applies, so unlike the one we just discussed, which applies to paper documents, computerized information, everything, this law applies only to computerized data. And it requires certain notification and reporting obligations when there's unauthorized access to or acquisition of unencrypted personal information. So I've been telling folks for a couple of years now that the AG's office has really wanted to update this statute. We got interrupted with the pandemic last year. It didn't happen. On June 5th, finally, the Senate approved a House bill. We're now awaiting the governor's signature. It's Public Act 21-59, I think, which makes some pretty significant changes to this data breach statute. And this is going to have far-reaching implications, not only for your business, but for your client's business. So under the current statute, which is effective only until September 30th, personal information is defined as a name in combination with one of these items, one of the four items that's on this list: social security number, driver's license number, or state identification number, credit or debit card number, or financial account number. Effective October 1st, the definition of personal information has exploded. And Scott, if you go to the next slide, we'll see what that looks like now. We now include in the definition of personal information biometric data, an expanded definition of government IDs, health data, insurance data, login information for online accounts. It's pretty significant. And quite frankly, in line with many of the other states' data privacy laws. I think Connecticut was a little behind the ball in terms of what it considered personal information. But this is important to understand because previously we had pretty much been saying that unless a social security number or driver's license number is involved, or a full financial account number, like a full credit card number or bank account number, you really weren't worried about reporting to the AG's office. Now there's going to be a lot more reporting. You can move on to the next slide, Scott. Another notable change is that with this public act, they're changing the applicability criteria. So until September 30th, this statute applies only to those conducting business in the state who maintain, license, or own computerized data that includes personal information. But as of October 1st, they took out the criteria of conducting business. So, which is similar to what many states have done. And that just means that those organizations doing business in other states that aren't actually doing business in Connecticut, but happen to have information about Connecticut residents that meets the definition of personal information. If they have a data breach, they must comply with all the reporting obligations here. So this will be more significant to organizations outside of the state. So that's worth noting. So what happens when there's access, unauthorized access to or acquisition of personal information? You've got to notify the individual whose information was involved, and you've got to notify the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office actually has a web page dedicated to this that has a link on it with an email address, which is how you make the report. You make the report via email. And they provide a really good explanation right on that website there. It's pretty self-explanatory. And I'll tell you, having done many, many breach reports to the AG's office, you just need to be detailed enough so the Attorney General's office is comfortable that you've done a fair enough investigation, you've determined what the issue is, and you've put some corrective measures in place to make sure this isn't going to happen again, and you've protected people who have been impacted. So until September 30th, you have 90 days from discovering that there was a breach to make this notice. Effective October 1st, it's now 60 days. And 60 days, quite frankly, is more in line with some of the other laws out there. The caveat to that is those are the timeframes unless a shorter federal timeframe applies, or if law enforcement says, hey, look, we're in the middle of an investigation, and if you provide notice, it would impede the criminal investigation. If that happens, you need that in writing from law enforcement. In terms of a shorter federal timeframe applying, it's worth, by way of example, notification for a HIPAA breach right now is 60 days from the date of discovery, but there have been proposed changes to HIPAA to make it 15 days. So if that change goes through, and if it's a HIPAA breach, which now, since personal information involves medical information, you're also going to have to report to the AG's office. That means your reporting timeframe to the AG could be even shorter than the 60 days. You've got to look at those other pieces that apply. In the data breach statute, you're not required to provide notice if your investigation reveals that the data breach is not likely to result in harm to the person whose information was compromised. Notably, the Public Act 2159 removed some confusing language that was in this not likely to result in harm provision. It used to say, after consultation or in consultation with law enforcement, which is just really confusing because you never actually consult with law enforcement when you're investigating what's happened with a data breach. I think that's back from when data breaches were less common and law enforcement was always involved, but now data breaches are happening, as Scott will tell you, thousands of times a day. And other than making sort of an online report to a federal agency, you're not really involving law enforcement unless it's the colonial pipeline that's involved. And those aren't the things that you're going to be likely to be dealing with. All right. So the statute requires 2 years of identity theft protection services if the social security number or a taxpayer ID number is involved. The addition of the taxpayer ID number is new with this public act. But the identity theft protection services for 2 years is not new. The statute also says that if you have an information security policy that details your efforts to protect personal information that you collect, and you comply with your policy, and you comply with the timeframes that are set forth in this statute, you shall be deemed to be in compliance with the data breach law. And essentially what this means is that the Attorney General is going to be far less likely to investigate your breach situation. So it's a good idea. And there are also other good ideas to have an information security policy. I'll give you two, and I'll probably mention them again later. One is if you do any business in Massachusetts, or if you have the information of any Massachusetts residents, you are required by Massachusetts law to have a written information security policy or plan. On the New York side, New York requires that you have that you take reasonable steps to protect data. And really the only way to prove that you've done that is if you have something in writing. So there are really good reasons why you should have a written information security policy. And I did at some point create a template for this for law firms. And if you're interested in it, shoot me an email. I'm happy to share it with you. I'm always nervous about giving someone a template because, as you all know, you're probably nervous about giving your clients templates. You can't just plug things in, right? It's highly customized because it's about what you do, but at least it will give you the steps that you need to walk through and that your policy needs to cover. Failing to comply with the data breach statute equals an Unfair Trade Practices Act, and it's enforced by the Attorney General's office. And they are active in enforcement of this statute.
Dena, real quick on that. So there's no private right for a HIPAA claim under there. It's only enforced by the AG. Is that correct?
So there's no private right for a HIPAA claim, but there's nothing that says that someone can't bring a private action for negligent practices in maintaining data. And I'm actually going to talk about, there was a new law that was passed also this session that talks a little bit about how that can be limited. But so nothing specific on HIPAA, but certainly there can be a private cause of action.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so a couple of other notable additions from this public act. One, as I mentioned earlier, now any HIPAA breach falls under this statute. So I do a lot of healthcare work. I represent a lot of healthcare clients, and we do a lot of breach reporting to the federal government. But now we're going to also have to do a lot of breach reporting to the state AG. There are special notification rules in terms of notifying individuals about breaches when it involves compromised login credentials, because essentially, if you're just sending it to, or email providers, because if you're just sending it to the account that's been compromised, chances are it's only the hacker that's going to get the message that something's been compromised. So there are some new rules around that. And then there is an exemption from FOIA. Any investigative documents collected by the Attorney General's office are not subject to public disclosure under FOIA, which is really important, and Scott can highlight this, really important because what you're doing for your security measures is not something you want to be putting out there so that folks know exactly how to get in. Okay, so I mentioned this a second ago, House Bill 6607, which doesn't have a public act number yet, but is also just waiting for the governor's signature, was adopted this session. It's an act incentivizing the adoption of cybersecurity standards for business. And basically it just says that businesses, and businesses defined incredibly broadly, so pretty much any business that adopts a standard designed to reduce the risk of a cyber attack will be entitled to will avoid the assessment of punitive damages if there's a tort action. A couple of really important points about this. One is that the statute identifies some recognized frameworks and standards. I will tell you that they are cumbersome and they're designed for Fortune 500 companies, and they'll be a little difficult to navigate, especially for smaller firms in terms of how do you adopt something. I think we'll get more guidance on what this ultimately looks like. I think we could use something like a NIST standard and create, some high level, some high level standards based on NIST that law firms can can adhere to, but something like ISO 27000 is for massive multinational corporations, and that stuff will be sort of bulky. It also includes regulatory frameworks. So if you're subject to a regulatory framework like HIPAA or Gramm-Leach-Bliley, and you can prove that you've adopted the standards that are in there and you comply with them, then you can take advantage of this protection. It's important to note that the first version of this bill was an affirmative defense. It wasn't just avoiding the assessment of punitive damages. And quite frankly, that's a much more useful statute. This is obviously the product of sausage making, and somehow someone thought that avoiding the assessment of punitive damages would be incentive enough. I really don't think it will be, because you can still be sued, you can still get actual consequential damages after a breach. So it's unfortunate. And a number of other states have actually adopted a statute that provides an affirmative defense. Ohio is one that comes to mind, and that's really a business-friendly statute. It's unfortunate we didn't see that here, because as you all know, data breaches are happening with an alarming frequency. And despite your efforts, you could be doing everything right, and it's still a criminal act. And it would be really great if there was some protection, because these things can get incredibly expensive. I mean, you should have cyber liability insurance that provides protection and coverage for all of those costs and everything, but we really shouldn't have to also be worried about being sued when you've taken the appropriate steps and you've not been negligent.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but just so with the punitives generally in the civil litigation world, the punitives are a measure of how gross your conduct was. I'm assuming that if somebody has a policy in place, they adhere to it. It's not one of these policies for a Fortune 500 company, but it's a reasonable policy. They would generally be probably relatively safe from a punitive damage award anyway. As long as a jury thought their policy was reasonable for their size of business, I assume.
I absolutely agree with you, Chris, and I think you're 100% right. And this is like what happens with sausage making, right? That's what happens at the legislature, is that the structure that this statute proposes is, in terms of identifying these frameworks and then getting the affirmative defense, it's actually really difficult to adopt one of these frameworks. So you get a real prize, you get that affirmative defense. I think you're absolutely right. There's not much bang for your buck here. If you're doing other things anyways, even if you're doing nothing, there's not a ton of bang for your buck here, because you just roll the dice and say, it's only 10% likely that I'll have an incident, and I don't need to invest all this time, money, and energy. But to your point, if you can show you've made reasonable efforts to protect the data, even if it doesn't meet the standards here, I think you're right. You're not going to see punitives.
And I don't mean to get you off topic, but just on this notion of, lawsuits based on this. One of the things, I try and pay attention to this stuff, pretty well, but one of the things that strikes me as problematic with lawsuits is like demonstrating, damages like that one particular data breach was the proximate cause for somebody's, loss, that, whether it's, ID theft or something like that. I can tell you, I've gotten, I don't know how many notifications over the past couple of years, and I'm offered, some level of, credit monitoring or whatever. But if I go into my bank account, and find out that somebody, was accessing my credit card, I wouldn't even know where to begin, like suing somebody for it.
Yeah, well, you've identified what's been most problematic in class action suits after these major data breaches. So we've actually seen a shift in the circuits from allowing, and there are still some circuits that allow plaintiffs to proceed based on the fear that something could happen without having any proof or evidence that they suffered any harm. But a number of circuits, and I think now the majority of circuits, have concluded that look, you got to show that there's been some damage somewhere. You can't just be afraid that something will happen. And so I think things are heading in that direction, especially in the class action suits. In the individual lawsuits, I think it's really easy to get summary judgment in a matter where someone says, I'm just afraid that something will happen.
Yeah, okay. That's what I suspected, but I was curious, but thank you.
Yeah.
I hope I didn't get you off course.
No. We can go to the next one, Scott. So just a quick note of other potential sources of privacy obligations for you and your clients. Contracts are going to be the next biggest source of your privacy obligations. Many of your clients may be subject to other data privacy laws like GDPR, CCPA, CCPRA, now the Virginia law, New York DFS, which has certain requirements for when they're dealing with vendors like a law firm. So you may have obligations just because of the relationship you have with the client. State contracts, all state contracts have very specific data privacy provisions in them that are based on state laws that apply to state contractors. If you do work for a healthcare entity like I do, and you're a business associate, you're subject to HIPAA. New York DFS, which is the cybersecurity rules that apply in the financial sector, and in Massachusetts, they both have regulatory schemes that require that vendors agree by contract to implement and maintain certain measures to protect personal information. And then I think the last slide I've got here, we're just talking about best practices. Written information security plan. I've already mentioned it's helpful in Connecticut because you get sort of that presumption of compliance with the data breach law. It's required in Massachusetts, and it's helpful in New York. Privacy protection policy, really it's required, and so you should do it, and it's not really labor intensive. Vendor due diligence, when you engage a vendor who's going to have any access to your information, and folks, that's far more vendors than you may think, you need to be doing some due diligence on those vendors to make sure that they have their ducks in a row for what they're doing with your data. An external privacy notice on your website is useful if your website is collecting information from your clients, or if you have clients who are collecting information about customers on their website, they're going to need a privacy notice externally. And then an internal privacy policy about what you're doing with your data, and that's essentially a written information security plan. It's best to have an incident response plan. So when and if something happens, you're not Googling what to do in the event of a data breach at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, because that's when it's going to happen. And Scott's going to be having a margarita somewhere, and you're going to want to know that you already have a plan. And then training, right? Train your staff. Don't click on things. Please don't click on things that you shouldn't be clicking on, which is where Scott comes in, because he can put all sorts of measures in to protect us from ourselves. So with that, I think we can kick things over to Scott.
Thank you, Dena. That was, as always, very informational. I did not even know about the new laws that are proposed or in place at this point. But it's funny you mentioned biometrics is added to the list of data now. And Snapchat TikTok just announced that they will again try to collect biometrics from US citizens. So something to think about before you start posting to TikTok. But let's talk about how data breaches occur. Let's start with that so you know what to look for. And a data breach will occur through unpatched software like your operating system, Windows 10, for you, hopefully you're on Windows 10 at this point. Productivity software like Microsoft Office or Adobe, or your browsers, Chrome, Firefox, and your connection software, whatever you might be using, whether it's TeamViewer or any of the other ones that are out there for connecting back to your computer, or your VPN software. VPN softwares have notoriously been compromised in the last couple of years. That actually is one of the, they think was one of the ways they got into Orion. What's the name of the company now? I can't think of it. Was the big supply chain attacker late last year. Weak guessable passwords, and then I put RDP because remote desktop protocol is the second most compromised vector out there today. If you have, and I've seen it, I saw it with one of the municipalities here in Connecticut, where they sent, when COVID started, they sent their employees home. They said, here's how you get on. They gave them a link to the remote desktop. They put in a very weak password, and that's it. They're on their desktop at work. That is a recipe for disaster, especially if they have a weak guessable password, which most people do still. The most commonly compromised password is still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Exposed vulnerabilities.
That's punitive damages.
Yes, it is, absolutely. Exposed vulnerabilities, meaning you were told that your VPN software, whatever it might be, is vulnerable, but you did nothing to patch it. You did nothing to update it. And then phishing, again, this is the single most common way for an attacker to get in, is through phishing. And there's all sorts of ways to do phishing. And we'll get into some of that in a moment. But it starts with a strong password policy. Chris, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and we're probably going to end up doing an entire presentation just on how to create a strong password policy. Your passwords should be uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and special characters. The more characters, the less chance of it being cracked. And I have a graphic that I sometimes share on social media. The difference between a 9-character password and a 10-character password and the amount of time it takes to crack it is very significant. And I'm not talking about days or weeks, I'm talking years or decades. Never reuse passwords. So this is where part of the conversation earlier, where Chris asked, how do I know which breach it's tied to? Well, if you're using a different password on every platform or every application or every website you log into, whether it's internal on your network or external, it's easier to figure out where the problem is. There was a company I just saw there. Intuit, TurboTax. TurboTax accounts were being compromised, and it was nothing that Intuit did wrong. It was, well, they did one thing wrong, but I'll get to that. They, the reason those TurboTax accounts were compromised is because the credentials, the username and passwords, were already on the dark web. So somebody somewhere writes a script and says, let's check all these TurboTax accounts against all of these credentials. And they get into those accounts, they take over the accounts, and you cannot get it back once that happens. Use a password manager. There are dozens, if not hundreds of them out there at this point. I prefer LastPass. Some people don't like internet-based password managers. That's fine. There are, computer or phone-based password managers you could use as well. But if you use a password manager, you never have to remember the password, which is better for you. And then 2FA, which is two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, or biometrics. And of course, this is why the concern that biometrics is being stored somewhere else could be a problem, but these should be in place. Now, if TurboTax enforced the use of multi-factor authentication, then those accounts would not have been compromised. So that is the one thing they did wrong. But beyond that, it wasn't like there was a glaring hole in their software or anything like that. It was because the user's passwords, which they've used somewhere else on another breach, was stored on a website on the dark web. So I have either two-factor or multi-factor, and in some cases, biometrics turned on everywhere. So if I'm going to remote into a client's computer, it asks me, it scans my face twice and then asks me to put in a password before I can connect to that computer, and then tells me the location that I'm connecting from. So that's another form of authentication, is your location. You should have a business continuity or disaster recovery. You hear BCDR a lot. Most people just refer to this as a backup plan. I usually recommend that you have a local backup as well as a cloud backup with separate credentials. The local backup, because it's quicker to restore from. However, it's also quicker to access if somebody does gain access to your network. So they could get on and wipe out your local backup or encrypt it or whatever it may be. Then if you have the cloud backup, you can restore from that, as long as it has separate credentials. Because if I get onto your network as a hacker or ransomware person and start encrypting things, and this has the same credentials or one password for everything, and I can connect to that as well, I can encrypt all of that as well. So it's doing you no good at that point. If you do have a cloud backup, make sure it's being replicated as well. So most of the clients I work with, their stuff is going into Amazon or is using a service that backs up. So, well, that's next actually. So it's going into Amazon and then it gets replicated to another, they call them zones in Amazon. So I might have a backup into Virginia data center, and then it gets backed up to another location around the world somewhere. Microsoft 365 or G Suite backup. This is also important. And both of these G Suite is actually Google Workspace now. I didn't update that. They change their name every couple of years, but it's Google. If neither one of these companies guarantees that your data will be there, it's part of their policy. They do not guarantee it. So you should back it up. So everybody says, oh, I have, Microsoft 365, my email is safe, it's in the cloud. But no, it's not. Because if Microsoft has an incident, and they've had some, SolarWinds, that was the name of the company. SolarWinds got into Microsoft's network. The hackers that got into SolarWinds got into Microsoft's network too, and then started back-ending into some of the CSPs. These are the resellers, essentially, like myself. So I sell Microsoft 365. And they got into some of those accounts and were able to get into end user email accounts. And they could start forwarding, they could start deleting, and then you lose everything because you didn't back it up. Confirmed backups are completed and valid and still there. One of the first signs that you're about to be hit with a ransomware attack is they delete your backups. So they don't stop your backup from running, but they go in after and delete it. So you might not be paying attention to your backups and whether or not they're still there until you need them, and they're gone, and now you're hit with a ransomware attack. And you should test the backup every, I don't know, maybe once a quarter just to make sure it's working, or more if you're really paranoid. And then you should also encrypt your data. So it should be encrypted at rest. It should be encrypted in transit as well. So you want to use a backup service that's encrypting it as it's uploading to wherever it's uploading to. And then you want to have your laptops, desktops, phones, all encrypted. And one question I always get is, why do I need to encrypt my desktop? It's not going anywhere. They get stolen too. Servers get stolen too. They walk right out the door. It's happened more than I can count. Somebody will break in, steal anything they could find that looks like it might be worth something, and out the door it goes. And if it's not encrypted, under HIPAA, you have to report it. And under most circumstances, it's still data theft because it's readable. Anti-malware and antivirus software. This is the software that everybody should have running, and you really don't have a choice anymore with Windows 10 anyway. That will scan stuff that comes into your computer, into your network, so into your computer specifically, to see if it's malicious in nature. And that's great. The problem with, let's say, Windows Defender or some of the other malware, the ones you're probably more familiar with, Norton, McAfee, those people of the world, is they don't scan, they're not proactive. So they scan for signatures that they know exist. However, if you don't update your malware software, anti-malware software, as soon as there's an update available, you're at risk. Even if you do update it as soon as there's an update available, you're at risk, because the number of new malware that comes out every single day is I believe it's in the hundreds of thousands at this point. It is astronomical, and there's no way these companies can keep up with it. So how do you deal with that? There's a few ways. There is now anti-malware, antivirus software. They're called EDRs or NDRs, where instead of waiting for the signature, they still look for signatures because they're still out there, but they also look for anomalies. So let's say I download something from the internet and the software says this isn't normal activity for him. We need to quarantine this until somebody could take a look to see what it was. And yes, sometimes it quarantines legitimate things, but it's better safe than sorry. Than somebody who knows what they're looking for and can upload it to. There are places where you could check the coding of that software to see if it's legitimate or not, if it's malicious in nature. Then we can do that and make sure that it is safe. It's, again, better safe than sorry. So that's what it looks for, things that are out of the ordinary. It looks for anomalies within your servers, your computers, and there are some out there that do for networking equipment as well. Hunting So also not waiting to be attacked, but looking for the attack. So we use software that looks for things that are being changed within Windows itself. So Microsoft Windows, or, you know, if you have Apple, it will look for that as well. And then we also now, and this is not that hard to do, but we also now will put a document on any sensitive system and label it something that looks enticing to a hacker. So I have, you know, documents that say usernames and passwords or tax information or something like that, and just label it like that. And then if that document gets opened and it wasn't somebody who's supposed to be opening it, I know somebody's on my network. So in my case, I get an alert. If a document is opened or altered in any way, and it's a document I created just for that purpose, I'll get an alert. And right away, I know somebody's on the network. So this is a relatively new way of, you know, kind of not really mitigation, but in a way being prepared. And then if I see that, right away, I'm shutting down the network, shutting everything down. Your patching program, again, one of the most important things, you know, Windows updates came out last week. Yeah, last week. The security updates. So they update multiple times a month now. It's actually getting a little annoying, but the security updates come out the second Tuesday of the month. And most other software vendors fall in line with that day or right around that day. So Microsoft Windows is the second Tuesday of every month. Almost everybody else does it right around the same day. Software updates typically fix vulnerabilities. They address 0 days, which is vulnerabilities that are known but not yet patched and may or may not be exposed already or exploited already. If that is happening, if you have a 0 day that's being exploited, you know, it's the best thing you can do is take whatever it is offline if you can. And then of course, you should complete patching as soon as possible. As we've probably all aware, sometimes Microsoft doesn't get it right, or whoever, Adobe doesn't get it right and screws everything up. So I typically wait 3 or 4 days unless it's something that's already being exploited in the wild. I will wait 3 or 4 days. I usually wait till the Friday or Saturday after the update comes out, just to make sure there aren't any issues. This past month, I think, was quiet, but I think it was April. Microsoft's update was taking out network printers and causing computers to blue screen, because of, if you had a network printer, it was causing your computer to blue screen, but only certain printers. So, but you know, waiting, in some cases, I've seen attacks that occur because somebody hasn't updated their VPN software in 2 or 3 years. And that's just not acceptable. And that goes back to what you were saying before about, you know, at that point, you're negligent. And then as Dena pointed out earlier, incident response, you should have an incident response. You know, we talk about all the different frameworks. So NIST cybersecurity framework is a massive framework, but you can make it smaller for your organization. And then part of that is the incident response. If a security incident or a breach occurs, how do you respond? What are you doing to address that issue? Do you have a plan in place to shut everything down should you know you're getting attacked? What do you do on weekends and long holidays and things like that to address any issues? Who is your contact if something goes wrong? How do you restore from a backup? Do you have a change management in place? Meaning, do you know what changes have been done within your network over any period of time? Well, on your computers in your network with it software, most of the attorneys are using, I think all of you are using some type of software to manage your practice. You know, what version of that software are you on, or is that being backed up somewhere? All of these things need to be in an incident response plan. And then how do you communicate with your clients and employees? Mostly Dena talked about this already. Are you following best practices and state federal laws for reporting? Depending on what you do, you may have certain requirements that the business next door to you does not have. It's all got to be documented. It's all got to be there in case something does happen. And my favorite thing, I guess you could say, is education. That's why we do this every month. People are the weakest link in any cybersecurity plan. There are books out there that teach people how to social engineer people. There are websites solely dedicated to that. I've done it with permission to people. I have actually sat down with an IT team and asked the employees, in casual conversation, what the answers to their security questions are. So in other words, what was your favorite concert, or who's your, what school did you graduate from, or where were you born? Those kind of questions, those are typical security questions. And I have casual conversations with members of an IT team that do security, and they've answered the questions. So, you might, if you're on Facebook, you see those Facebook quizzes, what was your favorite concert? And I don't know, all those silly quizzes. That's exactly what that is. That's social engineering. That's somebody gathering information so that they can they can leverage that information more to attack. A plan that educates, simulates, and prepares everyone in your business is the most important component of a strong data protection plan. Again, that's why I do this. I like to educate. The phishing attacks are through the roof. All the attacks are through the roof every day now. I'm seeing, I don't know, half a dozen large organizations being compromised mostly through ransomware, but other data breaches as well. And a lot of them start with phishing. And if I see one where it says, multiple accounts were compromised, it tells me there is zero phishing mitigation in place. If you're not learning, or at least, just casually looking to see what active campaigns are out there, Microsoft is a huge target. Just as an example, you may get an email that says, we need to verify your credentials, click here, from Microsoft, and you click and it takes you to a website. Actually, I'll give you the perfect example. You download an Excel document that you think is an Excel document, and you get a prompt that says you need to log in. Now, we all know Microsoft. If you're using Microsoft 365, every now and again, you have to log back into your account for whatever reason. So you get this prompt, you click on it, it takes you to a page that looks like a Microsoft login. So you log in, they've got your credentials. They now have access to your account. You may not realize it at that point. Maybe you do, and you're quick enough to avoid any damage. Chances are you're not. These are the kinds of things that I educate people on. I got one today for Best Buy Geek Squad, and it was a phishing attack. They spelled invoice wrong. That was the first warning. The second one was the account number was X. I don't have a Best Buy account anyway, but the account number was all X's. Didn't have my name, and it said I bought WebRoot, which I don't use WebRoot. So I knew right away it was a phishing attack. But I got that same email forwarded to me yesterday from a client and asked me if it was legit, and they don't use WebRoot. So it really, thankfully they forwarded it to me rather than clicking. It was a link to update the account information. Thankfully, they forwarded it to me instead of actually doing what the email wanted them to do, because I've educated this person in the past. So that's a big part of it. We do phishing simulation. I think I need to do some for Dena now that she's got some people on board. Meaning I send a fake phishing attack out, and then if you fall for it, you get a video or a message that says you fell for it. But keeping everybody aware that they're out there is probably the most important thing. So if you are handling your IT, your infrastructure on your own, just stay up to date on what's out there and update whoever's working in your organization, or even your peers. Let them know this is what's happening right now. There's still a lot of COVID-19 phishing scams. Usually the hot topics are the phishing scams, because we'll probably start seeing some around the Olympics now. The COVID-19 isn't going away. The vaccinations isn't going away. So all of those things you'll still see. When the holidays come, you see a lot of holiday phishing scams, just a lot of stuff out there.
And just to follow up on what Scott said about, if you manage your own IT, let me just say this to you: you shouldn't, right? We're lawyers. It's what we do. We're just like, I don't do my own taxes. I don't manage my own IT, even though I have a decent understanding. I don't have a good understanding. And quite frankly, none of us have a good understanding. You really do need someone to manage this from the outside. And it's not that expensive, and it's really worth it. I didn't plug Scott that time, but I really do intend to promote
information
him.
is right.
So
It's right here. got done faster than I thought I would. Any questions? I don't know. I wasn't monitoring the chat. No, there's nothing in the chat.
Well, that was great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Oops. What did I just do? I accidentally closed the screen sharing, but okay. We could still answer questions.
Lou, you're muted.
What else is new? Scott, you mentioned something about passwords, about like, you know, a 10-character password is much more secure than, say, a 9
Mhm.
password. Other than, you know, what kind of recommendations, other than one uppercase, one lowercase, plus a character, is there some other recommendation that you would make to make passwords secure, other than just the normal, those 3?
Yeah, so you don't have, I wouldn't do just one uppercase and one lowercase. I would do, you know, as many of each as possible, adding numbers and special characters. I know there are some websites that still don't allow special characters, and I don't get it. Or there's some that don't let you do as long as you want for a password. I don't understand the logic behind those two. But
Yeah,
out
the
here,
bank
show you.
doesn't let you do a long password, which is really annoying.
So here's what I mean. So if you have a 7-character password with cracking software, which is free, by the way, it's a Linux, it's all of these things are available on Linux distributions. I run one here in my office, one of those Linux distributions, and it's really not hard to crack a 7-character password. I've done it time and time again when people forgot their Windows passwords. 29 milliseconds. 8 characters takes 5 hours, 9, 5 days, 10, 4 months. So you see a big jump there, right? 11, 10 years, 12, 200 years. And then it keeps going up from there. You get into billions of years at some point. Now, this will all change. I think Chris and I had this conversation already too. When quantum computing becomes more prevalent, it will change significantly. But hopefully by then we have other measures of authentication that will help.
Scott, can I interrupt you 1 second? Just
Sure.
Can you just explain, maybe just explain to Lou what you mean by like cracking them, just like what the computer's actually doing, just like throwing numbers and passwords at it.
Exactly. So you download you can download a dictionary list, and there are, I don't know how many hundreds of them out there. You download a dictionary list, which is just a list of passwords, and then you load it up into a script, a program, and then that program just keeps trying all the different combinations until it finds one that works.
So figure, Lou, it's this dictionary he's talking about is billions potentially of different password combinations, just, you know, and the computer just goes so much faster than you or I could. It literally is just making, you know, potentially, you know, thousands to millions of attempts per second.
Right.
And so it can just, you know, 7 characters, it can work through every possible 7-character combination in existence in like the time it would take to blink. And so, but it becomes exponentially more difficult with every character. Thus, you know, you see the exponential curve for the character count.
Right.
Scott mentioned we're talking about putting on a CLE just about passwords, because it's just such a problem and it's so easy to solve, and there's so many different ways to do it that we could probably spend an hour and give people a lot of, you know, good thoughts. But Scott had mentioned a password manager. I use one. You know, if you have an iPhone, you know, you probably have something built in there that's pretty good, if not great, and costs nothing, you know, potentially. But there's a lot of other ones out there, and it just makes life so much easier. Remembering passwords, you know, coming up with different 12-character passwords for every online account you have is maddening, and they have to all be different, otherwise they're useless. I used to use the same one for everything. Years ago, you know, this just stupid website that I had an account on so I could, make stupid comments, got hacked. And then, my email address and password were posted on the internet, and literally every account I had now was vulnerable because I used the same password for everything. Now, luckily that was, 15 years ago, but you just can't do that. So now I use this password manager. I tend to use like Apple devices, so I use the kind of built-in one. The computer just picks a random password, it saves it. When I go back to that thing, all I have to do is either remember my computer password or use my face or thumb or whatever. And that website, has its, password filled in, and it's virtually impossible to, guess.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
the
we're going
key.
to spend
That's
some
the-
time going over stuff like that, probably in the next one of these, but there's a lot of really easy things you can do.
What's a good desktop password manager that you guys would recommend?
Not online based, I would say KeePass, and it's spelled KEE pass.
Good to know. Okay.
The longer the password, the better. Obviously, randomize as much as possible. There is one theory out there that you can use like song lyrics or movie quotes or things like that, and just change some of the letters for numbers and so forth. But even that, you'll need a password manager because it's going to be super difficult to remember all of that.
For sure.
Yeah.
Great.
Yep. Any other questions? All right. I guess we're done then. Well, thank you everyone for coming out. Or I shouldn't
Thank
say
you,
coming out.
guys.
Thank you for joining, not coming out. We're not quite there yet, almost. But thank
Thanks
you
to
for
both of
joining.
you. Presentation was excellent, very
Thank you.
helpful.
Thank you. And thank you, Dena. Always
Oh,
fun
absolutely.
doing these
Thank
with
you very much.
Thanks,
Very
guys.
much.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys. Have a good afternoon.